All right, so we're looking at Jumpform rescue today, yeah? Really, the Jumpform is probably one of the most hazardous, rescue environments I've seen, yeah? It's not defined as a confined space, but for all intensive purposes, it pretty much is, yeah? Really, the way that you're looking at the Jumpform is a whole different way of doing things. It's always easier to lower a casualty than it is to lift them. So the whole idea of coming up with an engineering solution where you're starting to cut these rescue doors so that you can open them up on subsequent levels so you end up with a clear descent to ground is going to basically revolutionise Jumpform rescue. You can imagine if we need to haul a casualty or lower them from level to level and then reset up the gear, because obviously your traditional ladder ways, none of your openings line up, do they? So if you want to move a casualty, vertically up and down, you're going to have to break gear down and set it up on each of those levels. As far as risk assessment goes, the more you break down something and set it up, the more inherent risk is going to be part of that, yeah? So the system we're using today is, we're on the top level, we haven't got any anchor points above us, have we? And everyone jokes that it'd always be nice to have a sky hook, but essentially what we're going to use is a tripod. So we have a heavy duty tripod. Any kind of artificial high anchor point always has a few stability issues, and I'll talk about those as I go through. But this is a pretty good bit of kit, and all a tripod essentially does is allows us to end up with an anchor point here. Now when you're hauling and lowering things, it's all about headroom. If you can end up with something anchored here, it obviously gives you the associated headroom to be able to manipulate your casualty, yeah, and your stretcher. As soon as you start lowering your anchor point, things become inherently more difficult, yeah? Now, it doesn't matter how intricate your rescue system is or how much time you spend developing it, there's always going to be a little bit of grunt work, all right? Essentially, we're going to set up this tripod over this hole. Now, we've also been considering some of the modifications that need to happen to this kind of isolation control for that to happen. Essentially, we're going to knock this side out, and you see we've obviously cut an area there where one of the legs of the tripod can go through. Obviously, as soon as I take this out, I've lost my isolation control. So the guys that are going to be putting this into position are essentially wearing harnesses and using restraint systems. Now, a couple of different ways to approach height safety. There's fall arrest systems. Fall arrest systems is always going to be some kind of fall distance incorporated into that. With a restraint system, you can modify the device so essentially you're under tension when you get towards the uncontrolled edge. If you're under tension, there's physically no way you're going to fall. Now, a lot of people say to me, mate, if I've got someone screaming and bleeding, I'm not going to take the time to look after my own safety. And, you're being proactive, you're doing the training, you're thinking about rescue now, which is certainly the way to do it. The time to work out rescue is not when it's, it's actually happening. Now be mindful, obviously one of your colleagues is going to be injured, that's why you're doing the rescue. Any rescue is obviously going to be scrutinised. Obviously internally with your own company, with the major contractor, heaven forbid maybe work cover get involved. Obviously when you're conducting the rescue, it makes sense that you're looking after your own safety. The fire brigade has an acronym, YOU. You, others, the unfortunate. Yep. The casualty is the last in your line of thinking. Now, we don't like to admit we've got emotional connections to the people we work with, but sometimes when someone is screaming and bleeding, you start to compromise your own safety. You obviously need to maintain that. It is an advantage that we're going to have a clear opening to ground, but what we've also done is we've opened up a big fall distance, haven't we? If we have all those doors open, we've got a bloody big long drop to ground. So as we're lowering the casualty, people will be transferring to lower levels, etc., yeah? It makes sense that as that casualty is being lowered and they're approaching the next door, that's when you open the next door. So in a way, you're limiting, the possibility of a fall distance, yeah? Okay, so obviously you're going to have a crew of guys that are setting up the tripod here and putting the device onto the tripod, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, statistically, when you think about accidents in a Jumpform, more likely the accident's going to be somewhere within the form and not the top level. Now, in the past, when they've looked at Jumpform rescue, they've kind of erred towards trying to have a lifting system to get the casualty back up to the top level. Now that's all well and good, but for some, inexplicable reason, maybe the tower crane's not working. If you'd said 6 months ago you're going to have a fire in a tower crane, everyone would have laughed at you. Now they've obviously changed their minds a little bit, yeah? So the system that we're coming up here with today essentially doesn't rely on any external resources. So, you know, high winds, for some, you know, hydraulic breakdown, for some reason the crane's out of action, it's nice to know that you've got an independent rescue system, yeah? So the tripod needs to be put into position. All right, the device we're using, and a couple of the guys got familiar with this yesterday, is called the CRD-MP. Now this had its origin in the Northern Hemisphere in the wind turbine industry. In the early days, a lot of those used to catch fire, and they needed a way to get out of wind turbines in a hurry. The great thing about this rescue device, and rescue in itself is inherently dangerous. You're taking someone from a bad position, you don't want to take them into a worse one, yeah? This device has a lot of anti-stuff-up factors that make it great to use. Essentially in a wind turbine, it's on fire, they would hook this to an anchor, they would connect this to themselves and step off. CRD, controlled rate of descent. It lowers at 1 metre a second. Now as we lower the casualty, we're going to build in a bit of friction by using this friction horn, and we're going to lower them in a controlled rate. You can use it in conjunction with a pole for remote attachment. So for some reason someone's fallen over the side, you can use this pole that corresponds to the length of the torn out lanyard. That goes in there. Obviously you need to give yourself the necessary room or length of line. You can reach down, remotely connect into that casualty, and then you have a handle that allows you to lift your casualty. You know, they're hard up on their lanyard. You can't undo their lanyard until you get some slack. This allows you to lift that casualty, undo their lanyard, and essentially lower them to ground. So, you know, again, it's a good device. It's got a lot of anti-stuff-up factors, but you can use it for lots of applications, yeah? All right, so that's the device. Whilst the guys are setting this up, you know, this is going to be on the central anchor point underneath the tripod. They're going to extend some line down to ground, and there'll be 2 guys down there who are going to hook the casualty in, and they're going to manipulate that casualty over the hole. As I said, there's always a little bit of grunt work involved in a rescue. The grunt work, I suppose, the guys down there again are on lanyards. They can't physically fall down the hole. They're going to start to position the casualty over the hole, yeah? They're going to lift it up. As they're lifting it up, the person up here is going to pull as much slack as possible. You pull slack so that eventually the casualty in the stretcher ends up suspended on the tripod. What you don't want is slack in systems. It's when you lift it up, there's a bit of slack and they drop the casualty, yeah? So you want to make sure you're reducing any possible shock loading. Saying that, that anchor point on that tripod's rated to 15 kilonewtons, 1.5 tonne. The rope in that device has a 2,300 kilo breaking strain. So again, you know, it's 9mm rope, you look at it, and at times when you're hanging off it looks like dental floss. Everything's got major safety factors involved, yeah? So, you know, essentially, in a real rescue, the guys will be setting this up whilst the people down there are obviously packaging the casualty into the stretcher, yeah? So, you know, this is a demonstration today which is obviously being filmed. It doesn't get away from the fact that we're obviously going to need to follow this with some training, yeah? Where we run through scenarios, yeah? Someone's got a broken leg. How do we get them down? Someone's, you know, in the worst position possible. A lot of it will be packaging the stretcher and moving the casualty through the structure to get them to a point where we can lower them, yeah? Okay? So essentially the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to modify this isolation control and bring the tripod in, yep? We'll probably slow it down, obviously, and that's the thing. You are never going to rush a rescue, you know? People say, well, what if it's a suspected spinal injury? Well, if you've got a suspected spinal injury and you can stabilise him, you're not going to move him anyway, are you? And people say, well, aren't emergency services going to take over? Well, yes, they'll come in and they'll assess the casualty, but you'll probably end up being part of moving that casualty anyway, yeah? You know, if your casualty is non-breathing, you breathe for them. If they're bleeding, you stop the bleeding. If they're cold, you make them warm. If they're hot, you cool them down. Basic first aid is not, you know, rocket science really, yeah? And if you're unsure and you can stabilise them, get outside help. Not to say that that outside help then won't utilise this system to eventually get them down, yeah? So you knowing what you're doing, assisting emergency services is obviously going to be crucial for the whole effort as well, yeah? Beautiful. Guys, I would now put that tagline bag down to ground, so if you want to put that down through, Just drop it down through the hole. Beautiful. All right. So what you're trying to do really is get him as high as you can, and Nelson will pull the slack, yeah? Head pulling the slack. All right, brake on. Beautiful. All right, bring him over the hole. And because he's under tension now, all your effort's over, yeah? Lovely darts. All right, Nelson. When you're ready, take the brake off. Brake off. All right, lower when ready. So we'll all stop there. Brake on. All right, guys, what you need to now do is use your lanyards to be able to move down to the next level and open the next hatch, yeah? Understood? So you can drop those down if you like. Obviously, if you had the personnel to be able to do it, you'd already have them on that level. So just use your hooks to move around the open hole, please. Obviously, it makes sense as soon as we can that we start closing these again, yeah? Cage door opened inways, it actually opens outways, so therefore it has to be open before you come into the jump. So whoever's in the first aid cage needs to be on some kind of restraint or fall arrest system. They have the ability to do that now. Even though the door opens out, there's still going to be about a 200, 300 mil gap. You need to obviously tie the first aid cage in against the structure just in case there's any uncontrolled movement, yeah? I've also got a secondary inertia reel in the first aid cage. That will come out and be connected to the stretcher. So as we're moving the stretcher into the cage, again, it's on a separate system. As you move it in, the inertia reel will take up the slack. So again, there won't be any stage during any of the critical control points where the casualty or the people around it aren't connected in. So, you know, really need to maintain your own safety during the rescue as well. So guys, with this setup, you could argue, well, yes, he is connected. But what you've got here now is two shock absorption systems. You've got a shock absorber on your lanyards that can tear out 1.75 metres plus the 2 metres, and then you've got, these can take up to 1 metre to kick in, plus a small shock absorber system here. So yes, he has a safety system, but if you like, he's added into any potential fall distance. So if you connect that straight to your rear loop, if you can get someone to do it for you, or if you can do it yourself, I can do it for you if you wish. What he's done now is, yes, he does need someone to help him connect in, but there's a lot less gear involved and there's less fall distance. Shock absorbers don't pull out the 1.75 metres, yeah? We throw that 70 kilo rescue dummy about 1 metre and your shock absorber will pull out that much, yeah? Do we know what a shock absorber does? It's a decelerator, yeah? So it starts to kick in at 200 kilos. So 200 kilos of force, the shock absorber starts to deploy so that the force on your body doesn't get to 6 kilonewtons, yep? So we make 100 and we drop test them and we actually look to see that the graph doesn't spike over 6 kilonewtons. So the more systems you have connected together, the bigger fall distance you have. That's one of the best tests you can do on an inertia reel. If you just grab that inertia reel for me, and just pull down on it quickly. Not many people do that before they use them. You know, you'll see people turn up and they'll just connect to them and take it for gospel that they work. Best test you can do, test the brake. What's it meant to do if you fall? It's meant to lock. Test the thing before you connect yourself on. Again, in the training, that's what we start to reinforce as well. You know, you trust your life on a system, you need to check it to make sure it's going to do what it needs to do in the unlikely event of a fall. Just in conclusion, obviously from what you've seen today is there's a number of steps, yep? And when you look at a rescue system, it's only as strong as its weakest link. So it doesn't matter how well Nelson lowers onto the device, if the tripod isn't set up correctly, your anchor point isn't, you know, bomb-proof as they say, obviously the system's going to come unstuck. So you've got lots of different elements in the rescue that need to all come together at the one time for the rescue to be a success. We've seen a really good base knowledge of skills amongst the crew, but again, the time to work out your rescue isn't during a real rescue, yeah? rescue skills are perishable. You know, if you work well, you've got, you know, guys that are trained, good systems of work, good equipment, you should never have to rescue, yeah? So therefore you don't get to practice. So that's the double-edged sword of rescue. You know, you don't get to practice the skills, therefore you lose the skills. So regular refreshment, not only when you refresh the training do you learn the skills or refresh them, you also build on that base skill as well, and everyone's body of knowledge comes up. The whole idea of rescue is that so everyone in the work group has confidence that each other, that, you know, different members can rescue each other, yeah? It gives you confidence in the work group that if you come unstuck, someone can get you down and get you to safety, yeah?